Get ready for a deep dive into a case that's both intriguing and unsettling. The life of Edward Surratt, an American murderer suspected of being tied to a string of unsolved cases. And not just in one state, but across multiple states.
Oh yeah, Surratt's story, it's fascinating. And it's
Yeah.
not just about listing his crimes,
Yeah.
It's about going deeper.
Right.
Like looking into the psychology of this guy, a man who might be behind way more than what he was actually convicted of.
It's like we have this puzzle,
Yeah.
but there are pieces missing.
Yeah.
And what we do see,
Yeah.
it's disturbing, to say the least.
It's
For
wrong,
this
yeah.
deep dive, we're going to be going through court records, news reports, even Surratt's own confessions to try and understand who this guy really was.
It's important, though, I think, as we go through all this to keep in mind that we're dealing with real people here. Real lives were impacted.
Yeah.
Victims, their families, and of course, Surratt himself.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning. Edward Surratt was born in 1941, Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. His early life, kind of a mixed bag. Seems like a pretty normal upbringing. His dad was a successful entrepreneur, but on the other hand, there were reports of abuse at home.
It's often like this, you see this kind of duality, these contrasts in the early lives of people who end up down similar paths.
Yeah.
It doesn't excuse anything, of course, but understanding how those early years, shape someone, it's crucial. It's like those early experiences lay the foundation.
Yeah.
Like in Surratt's case, the abuse he endured, it could be a factor in the way he behaved later on. Maybe it set him on this path that had, well, pretty devastating consequences.
And those behavioral issues, they pop up early. He was a good student, excelled actually in his early years. But by ninth grade, things changed. He lost interest in school, started getting into trouble, even with the law. And eventually he just dropped out. He even had a run-in with the law and arrest for assault. So his first real encounter with the criminal justice system.
Sometimes we brush off those early offenses as just kids being kids, youthful indiscretions.
Right.
But sometimes they're like warning signs.
Right.
It shows how important it is to step in early, address those underlying problems before they, spiral out of control.
His parents, they really tried to help him. They gave him financial support, pushed him to finish high school, even helped him get into Youngstown University in Ohio. But it seems like stability, it just wasn't in the cards for him. He drifted from job to job, never really finding his place.
That's a good point, this inability to find stability.
Yeah.
Even with a support system in place. It suggests there was something going on inside. Maybe those internal struggles were made even worse by the times he was living in.
And so in 1964, maybe looking for some structure, a fresh start, he gets drafted into the Army.
This is where things take a real turn for Surratt.
Mm.
The military, it can go either way, right? That rigid discipline, the demanding environment, it can be a good thing, provide some much-needed framework. But for some, it can make things worse, kind of expose their weaknesses.
And for Surratt, it seems like the military just amplified his struggles. He's stationed at Fort Dix, gets into trouble again, disciplinary issues. He even injured another soldier in a fight.
All those incidents, plus his past criminal record, it paints a picture, doesn't it? A man who's grappling with aggression, this disregard for authority. It's a pattern of behavior that's, well, it's troubling.
He gets discharged from the Army in '65 and heads back to Aliquippa. Sadly, his father had passed away earlier that year from throat cancer. Surratt ends up inheriting his father's business, but with no real experience, he drives it straight into bankruptcy. You'd think inheriting a successful business would be a good thing, right? A lifeline? But it just wasn't meant to be.
It's kind of ironic, right? Something that could have helped him stabilize his life ends up adding to his downward spiral. Losing his dad, the business failing, it all probably piled on top of his existing issues, pushing him towards choices that weren't good.
And so he's desperate for a change, burdened by all this debt. He makes a decision that's going to change everything. He enlists, this time in the Marine Corps. The year is 1966.
This is a turning point in Surratt's story. He gets sent to Vietnam in '67, gets thrown right into the thick of the Tet Offensive, one of the most brutal periods of the war. It's an experience that definitely leaves a mark. He gets a chest wound, a concussion from an explosion. These are injuries that very likely lead to PTSD.
In 1970, he's back in the U.S. He gets decorated for his service, but he carries those invisible scars of war. PTSD, it's complicated, often really debilitating. We need to think about how it might have played a role in what he did later on.
It's true that not everyone who goes through trauma becomes violent, but PTSD, it has these long-term effects.
Right.
And they're complex. It's really important to understand that when we're looking at Surratt's life, the Vietnam War with all that fighting, the psychological toll, It could have seriously messed with his worldview, his ability to control his violence.
So Surratt comes home, gets married, tries to build a life for himself, becomes a truck driver in North Carolina. But those behavioral issues, they were there before the military, remember, and they just got worse. It's a sad story, one we see all too often.
This escalation, it's a key part of understanding Surratt. It wasn't a sudden change. It was gradual, right? Starting with, just being antisocial, then escalating, and then finally in 1973, an arrest and a conviction for attempted rape of a minor. This whole pattern, it suggests there wasn't any real remorse there or even any attempt at turning his life around.
He gets paroled in 77, and that's when his name starts popping up in connection with a bunch of unsolved murders. It's like his release was the start of a really dark chapter.
And here's where our deep dive takes a chilling turn. Between 77 and 78, this wave of fear just washes over these communities. Pennsylvania, Ohio, South Carolina. It's a string of brutal murders. And they're not random. They're eerily similar. Often couples, targeted, attacked.
And here's the unsettling part. Surratt, as a truck driver during this time, his routes went through those very states where these murders were happening. It's not just a coincidence, right? It's something we have to consider. And then in June of 78, things take a really dramatic turn.
June 78. Surratt gets spotted in his hometown, Aliquippa, driving a car that belonged to a murder victim from South Carolina. This discovery, it shakes things up big time, throws the investigation wide open.
The victim was a 66-year-old man, Luther Langford. He was murdered in his home just days before. His wife was also attacked, but thankfully she survived. Can you imagine the shock when they realized the guy driving Langford's car is a convicted felon with a history of violence?
Right, talk about a break in the case. But catching Surratt, it wasn't going to be easy.
When the police tried to arrest Surratt, he fought back and he fought hard, managed to get away, disappeared into this industrial plant nearby, like something you see in a movie.
He just vanished, leaving the investigators scrambling.
But when they searched that car, Langford's car, it's like they hit the jackpot.
Oh,
a baseball bat with Surratt's fingerprints on it, and even worse, items that belonged to another murdered couple from Pennsylvania. It was like all these separate cases, they started to come together, pointing at one guy.
Finding those items, it was huge. It meant that Surratt wasn't just involved in one murder, he could be linked to multiple killings across state lines. They started using this technique, criminal profiling, looking at his behavior, the victims, the evidence, trying to connect the dots and get a clearer picture of what happened.
Criminal profiling, it sounds like something you'd see on TV, but this was real life. Real victims, families desperate for answers. And all this time, the pressure's building, Surratt's on the run, officially a wanted fugitive. The fear in those communities, it must have been intense.
It's a powerful tool, criminal profiling. Helps investigators get inside the mind of the offender, understand what drives them, how they operate. By looking at those patterns in Surratt's crimes, they could figure out what he might do next and catch him before he could hurt anyone else.
But even with the manhunt, Surratt was like a ghost. He stayed hidden. Until July 1st, 1978. That's when he pops up again, in a terrifying way. He breaks into a home in Volcano Beach, Florida, attacks a couple, and then this is the worst part. He rapes their 15-year-old daughter.
This crime, as awful as it was, it ended up being Surratt's downfall. After the attack, he doesn't run.
Yeah.
He stays in the house, drinks, does drugs, and passes out. Doesn't make sense, does it? It just raises more questions.
Almost like he wanted to get caught. Maybe the pressure of being on the run just got to him. Or maybe it was exhaustion, the drugs, the alcohol, who knows. But when he got caught, it was a huge relief for those communities that had been living in fear.
But even though they had him, the investigation wasn't over. Based on what they found and what Surratt himself said, they started looking into at least 18 murders that he might have been involved in. The scale of it, it's just mind-blowing. And it raises a scary thought. They might be dealing with a serial killer? It's hard to grasp, isn't it? Trying to understand how someone could do all that. And then there's the question of justice, right? How do you even begin to seek justice for so many victims, for their families?
It's overwhelming to even think about.
It is. But in Surratt's case, the first step toward justice started down in Florida. His trial for that attack in Volcano Beach, it began in the fall of '78. The evidence, there was so much of it. And he was found guilty. Burglary, assault, rape, attempted murder. They gave him 2 life sentences, plus another 200 years.
2 life sentences plus 200 years. That's a serious sentence, a strong message that this kind of violence won't be tolerated. But that was just for Florida, right?
Exactly. He still had charges in other states waiting for him.
After that Florida trial, they sent him to South Carolina to face trial for the murder of Luther Langford. Remember, he was driving Langford's car when they caught him.
Right. That trial was all about that murder and the attack on Langford's wife. And again, the evidence was strong. They had the murder weapon, his fingerprints, eyewitnesses.
So what happened?
Guilty. 2 more life sentences. Basically, guaranteeing he'd spend the rest of his life behind bars.
Yeah.
And at this point, everyone's thinking about those other murders. Would there be justice for those victims, too?
That's the big question. It seemed like they had him, the evidence was piling up, and he was already going away for life. What happened next?
Well, during that first trial, the one in Florida, Surratt did something unexpected. He confessed to another murder. This one was in Pennsylvania. The victim was a man named John Shelkons.
He confessed. Just like that. You'd think that would be enough to reopen the case, bring some peace to that victim's family.
You think so? But even with the confession, and they had evidence to back it up, the prosecutors in Pennsylvania, they made a tough call. They decided not to press any more charges.
Wait, what? Why not? He just admitted to another murder.
It's hard to understand, I know. But prosecutors, they have a lot to think about. Like, how much will another trial cost? How complicated will it be? What about the families, the emotional toll on them? And in the end, will another trial really change anything? Especially with a sentence like his.
So it was almost like those life sentences, they protected him in a way. Hard to wrap your head around that, especially when you think about those victims, those families still searching for answers.
It's a real dilemma. Justice is important, of course, but it's not always simple. Sometimes it comes down to practicality, to how resources are used. And sometimes it means some victims and their families don't get the closure they need.
So after all that, what about Surratt? Did he just fade away, become another inmate? Was that the end of his story?
Not quite. Surratt's story, it has a few more twists and turns. Turns out, even in prison, he was still a complicated guy, unpredictable. They moved him around different prisons in Florida. And then in '93, get this, he tries to escape.
Escape. He was already serving multiple life sentences.
Yep. Attacks a guard, steals a car, and tries to make a run for it. But it didn't last long. They caught him. Added more years to his sentence. Showed everyone he was still a danger.
It's unbelievable. The guy's doing life, and he still risks more time just to be free for a little while. Makes you think maybe he just had to be in control, had to defy the system that had locked him up.
It's possible. Like, he was so defiant, couldn't accept where he was. But what really shocked everyone were the confessions that came later. Years after he was convicted, Surratt starts talking about more murders.
More murders. He confessed to even more.
In 2007, he drops a bombshell, admits to 6 more murders, gives all these details about the victims, even tells them where some of the bodies are buried.
This is getting more and more complex. You'd think with those confessions, they'd reopen those cases. It could finally bring closure to those families after all these years.
You'd think so, right? But even with all that, no new charges were ever filed.
No, that doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't they go after him? He was giving them specific locations, potential burial sites.
It's frustrating. But we have to think about all the factors. Prosecutors, they have to look at the evidence, see if it's enough. Can they dig up those bodies? Can they prove he did it beyond a shadow of a doubt? And then there's the big question. If they do all that, will it really change anything for a guy who's already serving multiple life sentences?
I see what you mean, but it still feels like those families were denied justice.
It does, and it highlights a real problem. Sometimes the justice system, it just can't deliver the closure that people need, especially when dealing with someone like Surratt.
So, was that the end? Those 2007 confessions? Was that the last we heard from Surratt?
Not quite. There's one more twist. In 2021, Surratt, still in prison, confesses to 6 more murders, all in Pennsylvania.
Seriously, this guy never stopped confessing. Did they finally go after him this time, after all these years?
Nope. Same story, confessions, potential new evidence, but no new charges.
I can't believe it. So, after all this time, we still might not know the whole truth about Edward Surratt, about how many people he actually killed.
It's a chilling thought. We may never know how many victims there were, how much pain he caused.
This whole deep dive, it's been unsettling. I keep wondering, was he being honest in those confessions? Or was it all some kind of game, trying to get attention, exert some control from behind bars?
It's a question a lot of people have asked. Why would he admit to such horrible things if it didn't benefit him in any way? Maybe it was about control, or maybe, just maybe, it was a tiny bit of remorse, a need to get all those secrets off his chest after all these years. It's hard to say for sure.
It's like a puzzle, but with a lot of pieces missing. We might never have the full picture of what Edward Surratt did, and that's a tough thing to accept.
It is. But even without all the answers, it's still important to remember those victims. Their lives mattered. Their stories deserve to be remembered, even if we don't know all the details.
And we can't forget about all the people who worked so hard to get justice for them. The investigators, the lawyers, the people who shared information, who supported the victims. They did everything they could to stop a dangerous man, to prevent more tragedies.
It's inspiring, isn't it?
Yeah.
Their dedication to justice, even when it seemed impossible. It shows you that people never give up on the truth.
This deep dive, it's been a lot to process. It's scary to think there are other people like Edward Surratt out there hurting people, but it also gives me hope. Because even with all this darkness, there are people fighting for what's right, making sure the victims aren't forgotten.
That's where you come in, our listener. This deep dive, it's just the beginning. Learn more about these cases, about what makes people commit these crimes. Think about those tough questions we've talked about. Knowledge is power, right? The more we understand these things, the better chance we have of stopping them from happening again.
So, remember the victims, learn from what happened, and keep asking questions. Even when we don't have all the answers, the search for truth, for justice, it never really ends. This whole case, it leaves you feeling, I don't know, kind of uneasy. But is there something we can learn from all this? I mean, what's the point of going this deep into such a dark story?
Yeah, that's a good question. Cases like this, they're tough, but they can teach us things. Surratt's story, it shows us how important it is to understand what trauma can do to a person, how to spot the signs of violence before it gets out of control. And it reminds us that we still have a lot to learn about these unsolved crimes.
It also brings up those really tough questions about, whether it's even worth it to go after someone who's already serving life in prison. If they confess to more crimes, should we spend the time and money on another trial? Especially if it won't change their punishment.
It's a debate, for sure. And there's no easy answer. Every case is different. It's about trying to find that balance, right? Justice for all the victims, but also being realistic about what the legal system can do.
For me, it's that thought that Surratt might have gotten away with so much. That there might be a lot more victims out there, and we'll never know their stories.
It's a sad thought. But even if we don't have all the answers, we can still remember those victims. Their lives mattered. We need to remember them, even if their stories are still a mystery.
And let's not forget all the people who worked so hard on this case. The investigators, the prosecutors, everyone who helped try to bring Surratt to justice. They might not have found all the answers, but they stopped a dangerous man. Maybe they even saved lives.
It's amazing, isn't it, how dedicated they were? Even when it seemed impossible, it shows you the power of believing in truth, in justice.
This deep dive, it's been a heavy one. It's scary to think that there are people like Edward Surratt out there hurting others. But I also feel hope. Because even with all this darkness, there are people who are fighting for what's right. They're making sure the victims aren't forgotten.
And that's where you come in. Our listener, keep learning. Keep asking questions. Read about these cases. Try to understand why they happened. Knowledge is power, right? The more we know, the better chance we have of preventing this from happening again.
So remember the victims. Learn from their stories. And never stop asking those questions. Because even when things are unclear, we can't give up on the truth. We can't give up on justice.